to introduce Alison from the FT. She has been an amazing advocate for Ripple Effect, and she is really the reason that we're all in this room tonight. She has a lovely story to share with you, so thank you, Alison. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Faye, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. I'm really pleased that we were able to offer the space to Ripple Effect for this evening's event, and it came together. I'm very much looking forward to the panel, and I'm sure you are as well. I've always been passionate about environmental matters, and although I now work at the FT in the legal and compliance team, my degree was actually in environmental science, but it was so long ago and so much has changed since. It's a whole different world. But I first heard of Ripple Effect from a little flyer, I think, in my Riverford veg box quite a few years ago, back when it was called Send a Cow. And I just sort of looked into what you were doing and was really inspired. I thought it was amazing. So kept that in mind, you know, for quite a few years, bought a few cards from you and things like that. At the FT, we have a network of employee groups, and we're lucky enough that we're allocated an amount of advertising space in the newspaper that we can sort of donate to organisations that we feel are doing good work in our space, which is quite lucky, really. So, but I'm a member of the FT Sustainability Employee Group, and I was thrilled, I think it was a year or two, maybe 2 years ago, that we voted to allocate our full page ad to Ripple Effect. It looked amazing. It was a fantastic advert. It was really eye-catching. And I've been at the FT for more years than I care to mention, but Jen shared the video of Farmer Phoebe seeing the ad, herself in the ad, and it was just, will stand out as one of my best days at the FT, I have to say, and it still makes me smile even now, which is lovely. Jen said to me at the time that that's the Ripple Effect in action, and I'm really thrilled that the Ripple Effect is continuing here this evening. So thank you all for coming. A thank you to John Slade, our CCO, who's sort of enabled this event to happen, as well as the advertising donations, actually, and sadly couldn't make it this evening. But mostly thank you to Ripple Effect for all that you do. So I hope you enjoy the event, and I will pass over to Julian.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. It's a fantastic, yeah, you have to say a fantastic charity, but I think our vocabulary sometimes doesn't really do as many favors, really. The word charity evokes the wrong things for me. I think it's a great enabler. It's a philanthropic enabler, and it's a wonderful thing. So we're here to discuss a pretty serious topic, building a fairer farm food system in the face of climate change. Now, one reason I'm here is I'm Julian Baggini, and I'm a philosopher and writer by background, but I've had a long-running interest in food ethics, food systems. I wrote a book which came out last year on this, and one of the things that I came to a conclusion of writing that book was that the unfairness and injustice that we see in the food system it's not really a bug in the system, it's actually a feature. And what I mean is that the global food system at the moment can only work the way it does because there is unfairness built in. The cheap food that a lot of people get is predicated on the fact that people are not getting a fair, decent wage for a lot of the work they're doing, and we see that everywhere. You know, and these problems are not just far away. In Europe and in Britain, we have problems with exploited workers. So unfairness is a huge, huge problem. Fixing it is not going to be easy. It's going to require, I think, some serious or rewiring of the food system. But on top of that, we got climate change happening as well. You know, so you know, it's like a difficult problem becomes even more difficult because climate change is in the mix. So we've got really, really major problems to think about here. And I think an excellent job in assembling this panel. I'm going to let the panel each introduce themselves, actually, just briefly. So could each of you take a minute? I'll start with you, Meshark. Could you just take a minute to say who you are and what it is about this evening's theme that you interests you and you want to find out more about? Let's start with you, Meshark.
Thank you very much. My name's Meshark Sikuku. I work for Ripple Effect. and my title is the Farm Systems and Sustainability Coordinator. I'm based in Africa office in Nairobi. Ripple Effect has an office in the UK, but also has an office in Africa that coordinates programs within the Africa region, the 6 African countries where we work. So that is where I'm based. Nationality, I'm a Kenyan, born in Kenya and grown in Kenya, in the western part of Kenya, for those who might be knowing Kenya. And I'm very happy to be here to discuss this important subject of, fairer food systems, because we are working with the smallholder farmers, and I think the smallholder farmers are one of the vulnerable populations that are affected by unfair food system across the world, be it in Africa and other continents as well. So it's quite interesting, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. And I hope that I'm going to bring out some of the key issues that we think needs to be looked at when it comes to, addressing issues of, unfair food systems. And it is true, I agree with Julian, that the food systems that we have across, the world is unfair. And we need to discuss this, and we need to address these unfair food systems. And this is part of what we're trying to address as Ripple Effect, and I will be discussing that at a later time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Tara, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. So my name's Tara, and I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford, where I run a project called Table. So Table, and indeed I work on food systems issues in the round. So I look at the relationship between a range of social, ethical and environmental concerns that are caused by and that affect the food system, from climate change and biodiversity loss to food insecurity, hunger, overconsumption, and the kind of justice dimension that runs through it. What I would really like to do this evening is expand the idea of fairness to include not just the unfairness of relations between humans and across countries, but also between humans and the non-human world, so the other life forms that share the planet with us. And what I'd like to do this evening is actually just kind of learn from the other panelists about what ideas about fairness and justice look like to them, because it's one of those words that we can all get behind, but what fairness means also depends on where you are in the world, how you define it, and what your goals are for the food system. And what we do at Table is try and explore debates in and around the future of food, because while we can all agree in the generality about things, when it comes to the specifics of how we should farm, what we should eat, how we should organize our societies, how we should distribute the benefits and shoulder the costs, that very much depends on who you are and where you are and how you see things. So that's what I'd like to explore tonight.
Thanks so much indeed. No, I do recommend tabledebates.org. The website is well worth looking at and signing up to their newsletter, all free. You don't have to even pay for it, which seems a very fair deal for us, if not for them. Toshan.
Thanks. I'm Toshan. I'm the Global Chief Operating Officer of UPL. UPL is a top 5 crop protection and seeds player. We operate in close to 142 countries. I think this topic of fairness of food systems is something which not only as a company, but personally we are passionate about, but also it's critical to us. And the way we look at fairness in a food system is you have the grower, the farmer, which Meshark mentioned is extremely vulnerable. Farmers in African, Latin American, sub-Saharan Asian countries put up to 40% of their net worth on the line every season without knowing if they can get a return on investments. You have the growers at one end, you have the consumers, all of us, and others less privileged, where even a small rise in food price inflation can create havoc. Governments get toppled on food revolutions. And then the last constituent is our planet, because how do you balance this tripod? And this balancing act of the tripod is something which, at least from a private sector standpoint, from the government and the social sector, I think all of these three entities need to really figure out how to balance the tripod. And that's something which I'm very passionate about. And again, as Tara said, learning from the panelists and putting forth some bold solutions would be quite interesting.
Well, thanks very much. Well, listen, but towards the end of the hour, we're going to really want to focus on solutions and answers. But of course, in order to provide solutions, you got to start with a very clear diagnosis of what it is you're trying to solve. So the first thing I just want to ask the panel about is, for them to articulate, in what ways is and for why is the current food system unfair? And, maybe all three of you will point to the same things, but probably we'll get some slightly different angles from all of you. Can I start with you, Tara, this time? How would you describe what do you think are the most significant elements of unfairness in the food system, and why are they there? That's the important question.
Okay, so I'll do my best to give a sort of quite a kind of general overview. I think I'm going to start with the most obvious purpose of food, which is to feed people, which sometimes you forget because we talk about profit and all the rest of it. But in fact, ultimately, the point of the food system is to nourish us effectively. And it doesn't really do that very well. So we have more than enough food that is produced to feed our population that is soon to be 10 billion people. But we have these dual problems of, on the one hand, overconsumption, with 2.5 billion people worldwide now overweight or obese, and persistent and ongoing hunger and undernutrition at about 400 million people. And people who are, span that spectrum of overweight and undernutrition, there are the problems of micronutrient deficiencies, because we are very good at producing grains and cheap calories, but we're not very good at producing nutrient-rich food. So that's one form of injustice, and that's the injustice both to the people who are over-consuming and those who are under-consuming. I think the other is the question of the who gets to profit from the food system, with profits accumulating progressively along the supply chain, with the least going to the farmers, and within those, the least of all going to smallholder farmers. And then there's the unfairness in terms of environmental impacts and who bears the costs of that. So if you take the food system as a whole, it accounts for coming on for a third of global climate change in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge contributor to the problem, but in terms of our consumption patterns, it's the global north that consumes the diets that causes most of the damage in terms of per capita per person, because of our very kind of meat-rich, resource-intensive dietary patterns. But it's the global south where the impacts of climate change are going to be most acutely felt. And then, of course, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's the injustice to kind of the human and the non-human world. Our farming practices now make up about 45% of the Earth's surface. So, but in farming, we are pushing out other forms of life. I mean, there are some coexistence possible, but we have altered the face of the earth through our agricultural practices, and that means that other species are progressively being squeezed into kind of smaller and smaller patches of land. So there's that form of injustice as well. And then just a couple of other ones to note. There's, of course, the gender aspects of this, that women bear the brunt of poor access to food. They are often in the most sort of doing the most sort of drudgy sort of activities, whether it's, fetching water or weeding and all those sorts of activities. They are the least well paid, the most insecure, least access to land, and so on and so forth. So we have, and then the other thing I just wanted to say is the injustices across generations, because it's future generations that are going to suffer more from the consequences of these practices. So there's injustices of many, many forms. So when it comes to causes, well, those two are very multiple. And I think it's also worth saying that I think we've always had that injustice, and I'm not saying that as an excuse. It's always been like that. Well, it's always going to be like that. Nothing we can do about it. But it is worth noting that we've had these problems for a very long time. Your average agricultural labourer in Britain in the 18th century spent 70% of their income on food, and 50% of that was just on bread. You know, this is not a good state of affairs. So, you know, causes are multiple. Inequalities in land ownership is a huge one, and there's a gender dynamic to that. Corporate concentration in the food system, which has become progressively worse. Manipulation of trading rules and subsidies. Differential access to good quality land. Questions of value added along the supply chain. As I said, the profit that the farmer gets from, you know, the end result, which is like a donut or a packet of crisps, or, you know, these value added products is very, very small indeed. And then there's the kind of injustices of knowledge manipulation, where people have differing access to knowledge, whether that's you being manipulated by advertising or access to kind of technology and education. And then the other kind of cause, I think, is what I would call as a very anthropocentric mindset. Because we place us and ourselves and humanity first, which you could say is very natural, it means that we marginalize and discount the natural world. And I think that is a mindset issue that really needs changing. And then finally, I would say the only other issue is that perhaps our biology is rigged against us to favor short-term gains, to favor the kind of the sweet, the salt, the fatty, the profitable. And I think that is also something that we need to be aware of and challenge. So there are many, many other causes, but that's just for starters.
Well, thanks so much. It's true. These snacks at the back, but I was finding my hand just kept going like that. Okay, well, that's a very, very thorough list. I'm tempted to say there's nothing left for the other two to say, but I'm sure there is. There may be other things to add to the list, or there may be just more things to say about the things Tara said. So, Toshan, would you like to chip in?
I think, Julian, as you said, Tara was very comprehensive. I think the two aspects which I would like to focus on is, I think the system has lots of risks. If you take a grower, the grower doesn't know the assurance of prices. Given the climate change effects that are happening, the rain is not, it has to happen in the right time and in the right quantity. Too little, and also you are in trouble. Too much, you are in trouble. I think you see the impact of that. Suddenly in Australia, the cropping patterns are changing. In India, it's changing. In Brazil, it's changing. So the grower is just unsure. And again, the pricing dynamics. If I produce too much, there is a supply glut, in which case the grower does not receive the right price. So those are the risks. You move into the supply chain. If it's a car and you have all those cars being transported, even if there is no demand, they can stay in the warehouses. Food, if it stays, there is perishability. Now, if you want to reduce perishability, you need to think of all other dimensions. Then you have FX risk, because the food produced by the south is being eaten by the north. Okay, so you have the Brazil, which feeds a lot of the world, feeds the US. The Brazilian currency goes like a yo-yo, and that creates risk. So the number of risks factors which are there in the food system, unlike in some of the other value chains, I think is just very high. And the insurability of that is low. So that is one dimension. Tara focused on the inequalities, and those inequalities are multifold. There is between the large farmer in Brazil, average farmer in Brazil is 20,000 hectares. He's an average farmer. That average farmer is like a small and medium enterprise. He knows, he has access to knowledge, access to risk management, hedging techniques, the latest in financial services, latest in, they spray their crops using planes. Okay, whereas in Africa, you would put the fertilizer chemical on your backpack and you're spraying it. That backpack, the chemicals are hazardous. They are going to affect you in some shape or form. So the inequality in land holdings, the inequality in certain countries, they have actually, in terms of food security, they have ensured their citizens' safety, okay, at the cost of some other country. So you are also having this, the Middle East, by the way, because the biggest challenge Middle East has is they have tons of oil, but not food. So they have entered into G2G and food pacts around the world, which naturally protected their citizens, but created inequality elsewhere. So I think, just to summarize, I think there's two, and there's risks angles and there is inequalities, which create to me, a very unfair equation.
Can I just ask a follow-up question on that? You're talking about the risks that are borne by the farmers, particularly the smallholder farmers. To what extent is that a product of the fact that the global food system is primarily based around commodities? What I mean by that is that most crops are grown, they're sold to wholesalers, to middlemen, they then get lumped together with others, they go to process to make whatever it might be, rather than being sold, directly to people to eat and so forth. So an example of this might be, most cocoa is grown as commodity. You grow your cocoa, whatever the market price is that day, it gets bought. So if there's a lot, your price is really low, you may not make money on it, etc., etc. The alternative to that, there are some cocoa growers, not a lot, who are not working in the commodity markets. They're supplying, say, specialty bean to bar coffee makers, etc., etc. They have a relationship with the buyer is there to buy the crop, they stick by them. And a lot of people say that's fairer. So I'm just wondering, how much is the fact that so much of the food we produce is going into these commodity markets a reason for this exposure to risk?
See, I think there are two angles, Julian, to this point. I think one is, not everything can be top-end organic. Yeah. Okay, the most common, I think, you need bread, you need wheat, you need beef. I think, and those are, of course, there will be the high-end Wagyu and Kobe beef, but that's not what is being eaten by or sold most of the time. So yes, at the top end, you can solve for it between the commodity versus not, but rest is just a staple, which will be commodities. I think the second one is also what is being grown. I think to fruits and vegetables, if you need to grow fruits and vegetables, the cost of inputs is very high. Okay, the cash crops, the fertilizers, the crop protection chemicals, or the kinds of the risk that you have, because if you have a pest attack, okay, the farmer has put in a lot of money upfront. He or she needs to secure the output from that. As against if you have paddy and wheat, which are low value crops, but you don't need to protect as much. You can sow it, and broadly, if you have used the right things, it will grow and you will have a assured offtake. So there is imbalance between the cost of inputs by different crops. And if the cost of inputs goes higher and higher, I have invested significant amount and I need to lock in what I'm going to get from it. And that's when the weather events, Tara mentioned the supply chain. I think you have almost, for different crops, between 7 to 17 handoffs from the farm gate to the amazing crisps that you had. Now those 17 handoffs are not so easy to look at it, because the grower doesn't even know, unless now, of course, you have traceability and all, but the risks get amplified because of one mistake at the early part will just blow up by the time it reaches the table.
Thanks so much. Meshark, you work with a lot of these smallholder farmers who both the other panelists have suggested are the real brunt of this. So how do you see the issue? Where do you see the unfairnesses, and what do you see as the causes?
Thank you. I think for me, from the perspective of smallholder farmers, and particularly from the African perspective, one is access to food is a human right. The same way we have, the right to life. Very important and very fundamental. The right to access food. Now, the challenge that we have is this, that the food system is run through a competitive market system, regardless of, different abilities of various categories of people. So we have smallholder farmers who live in very difficult and unique circumstances, but they are subjected to global competitiveness. You know, smallholder farmers who have no access to information, they are not learned, they don't have the resources, the money, they live in very remote areas, you know, they don't have a lot of technology, they don't have the resources to invest, but they are subjected to the same competitive environment with the global competitors. And particularly the, you know, the corporates that are within the food system. I think to me, that lack of equity in terms of considering that this is a unique category of people, but who have the right to food, but they are living in unique circumstances, themselves, when you look at them, the access to resources is very limited. They don't have the information. I think subjecting them to equal competitive platforms with the global actors is unfair. There's no equity. So we need equity in that perspective. Secondly, the information and the training that we have given to farmers is unfair and is misleading. Because what we have done with the smallholder farmers, we have told them, okay, if you want to produce, this is what you need. You need the hybrid seed, you need the chemicals, you need the machinery, you need the technology, but these farmers have no access to these things. But because of the naivety and the lack of information, the smallholder farmers have fell into that trap and tried adopting those technologies, and they have failed. So why have we misled the smallholder farmers to adopt what they cannot adopt? Isn't that unfair? Number three, I think sometimes somebody said that you can look at a forest, but you can also look at, you know, specific individual trees within that forest. Sometimes when we have discussions at the global level, we talk about the African continent, we talk about the Asian continent. Do you see, we are talking about the continent. We are not talking about individual farmers. So when you start looking at Africa as a continent, without really looking at individual farmers, you miss the point. So the policy frameworks have been developed based on that global perception. And in the process, the smallholder farmers have been marginalized, they have been ignored. So the policy framework, the global policy framework when it comes to food systems is very, very unfair to smallholder farmers. To me, those are the three main ones that I will mention. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We'll have plenty of time for questions and stuff at the end, but there are things I'd like to follow up on, but maybe we'll save it actually. That's very interesting. The middle point that you were talking about, having sold them this idea of reliance on that what they need is more inputs, etc., etc. I was at the Oxford Farming Conferences last week, and arguably the same is true actually of farmers in the developed world as well. A lot of farmers there were saying that they used to use a lot of inputs and their productivity did go up, but the inputs are very expensive, so they weren't making a lot of profit. And a lot of people who have reduced those inputs, actually they are producing less a lot of the time, but they're more profitable. So actually the idea that, you know, we need all these inputs to drive up productivity is perhaps something which hasn't, Tara might have something to say about this now or later, but maybe hasn't served farmers in the developed world well either. Okay, I'll stay with you actually, Meshark, because I want to then move on to, we've talked about all these challenges, and my God, there are many of them. Once we throw climate change into the picture, how is this complicating it, disrupting it, or does it, or I dare say, does it create any opportunities? I can't see them from where I'm sitting, but maybe someone will surprise me some positive opportunities. So how is climate change affecting these unfairnesses?
Well, I think climate change is one of the, you know, challenges that smallholder farmers in Africa are going through. Currently, as we are talk about Zambia, for example. In Zambia, close to 6 million hectares of maize have been wiped out by drought. and it's subject to close to 4.5 million people to hunger, as we are talking now. In Burundi, in Uganda, in Kenya, the story is the same. In the Horn of Africa, that is Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, you know, all those countries, and South Sudan, close to 4 million people are facing hunger because of drought and climate change. And sometimes we have two extremes, because we have the drought, and then on the other hand, we have floods. So farmers will be in drought for a long period of time, and when they expect rains to come, the rains will come in floods and wash away the farms. Recently, I was on a field visit in the coastal Kenya, and we visited one farmer called Fatma, and Fatma took us to her farm of maize. All the maize had wilted. They're actually drying. 100% crop failure because of drought. And these are real climate change challenges that the smallholder farmers in Africa are going through. And so when we are talking about fairer food systems, I think climate change must come into the equation, because there are cases where other actors, governments, and so on, don't care about climate change. And so if we don't care about climate change, we are being unfair to smallholder farmers. And I think that message is very clear, that climate change, smallholder farmers, and actors within the climate change space, we need to be fair. And to be fair, or the only way to be fair, is to ensure that we are doing enough in order to curb the challenges of climate change. Reduce emissions so that global warming does not increase. There are predictions that by 2050, we'll have gone beyond the 1.5, we'll go to 3 degrees centigrade, you know, global warming. And that will be disastrous to, you know, smallholder farmers in Africa.
Thanks so much. Tara, so you started off with a very comprehensive list of problems. I dare not ask you how climate change might make it worse, because it's pretty bad, but say a little bit how it might be affecting things. And maybe I'm still holding out the possibility there might be an opportunity in climate change. Bit desperate, I know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the thing that climate change is going to do is going to exacerbate the existing inequalities and just make everything worse. And for countries, for poor countries, the costs of adaptation and the technology available for adaptation is just, you know, the ability to pay for that is just not there. I mean, there are so many ways in which climate change is going to make things worse at the kind of human level. I think it's going to exacerbate migration and associated conflict. I think just returning to sort of the agricultural side of things, there are studies that show that climate change is not just going to affect productivity, so crop yields, but also the nutritional content of crops when it comes to things like the micronutrients like zinc and iron and other trace nutrients. And, you know, this is a real problem for people who depend upon staple crops for the, you know, it's the main source of their calorie intakes, and it's the main source of those nutrients because the diets are lacking in other things. And if the nutritional content dwindles, then that will exacerbate those problems of micronutrient deficiencies. When it comes to it sort of benefits, I mean, I really struggle here. You know, the classic example is English wine. I mean, really. So yeah, I'm going to pass on that, I think. But I just want to say one other final thing. We talk about climate change. I want to zoom out and talk about the environmental crisis, because it's a nexus of concerns. It's biodiversity loss. It's about water stress, and water pollution, which is interfaces with climate change, but is also separate in its own right. So I think we need to think more broadly.
An omni-shambles, basically. Toshan, climate change's effect on these unfairnesses, how do you see it?
On the pessimistic side, I think what's it doing, to Meshark's point, is the viability of agriculture is actually reducing. Okay, because if I have to manage extremities both ways, it's really tough. And you're not seeing the next generation of farmers actually want to do farming. And you've seen that in many countries, they're giving up they're selling the land, they're getting into alternative professions. So there are many, many impacts that are happening, which are saying, if I'm not making a certain minimum return on my effort and hard work and on my land, what's in it for me? May I do something else? And now there is one positive element in some countries where co-ops are actually taking more control or helping or being formed, because individually as a smallholder farmer, I'm not able to. But again, it depends on country to country. It's not there everywhere, but the co-op movement, which is saying, okay, individually, I do not have the scale economics, but as a group, I'm actually able to have that. That is the positive side. The other interesting complication is many countries and regions are looking at climate change from their own standpoint. So if you look at the European Union, the kind of laws that they have passed, they have banned a whole host of chemicals. They are imposing a certain set of practices that the Aholds and Tesco's and Sainsbury's and others have to, when they are sourcing. The kind of things that they are saying, what causes for sustainable procurement. Now, the cost of all of that has to be borne by whom? Okay. Yes, so all of us are getting sustainably sourced sugar from Starbucks. But to grow that sustainable sugar in Costa Rica and many other countries, the inputs for the farmer, the costs are going up. And the question really becomes, is the farmer being compensated adequately for that additional things? Because I have no option. Starbucks or the global agro trading, only 4 companies in the world, which are called the ABCDs, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. They control trading across, and then in Africa, there is Olam. But these 5 companies have almost, and they are accepting what the consumer groups or the supermarkets want. The cost of that is all the way being passed on to the most vulnerable grower. And that is making the impact of climate change even worse for them.
That's a very interesting idea. By the way, beforehand, I was speaking to a woman who apologised. She said you have to leave early because we're babysitting. And I feel quite sorry because she's left before this point. It's all could be a bit depressing. Hopefully, it's going to be a little less depressing for the moment. But I mean, that point you last made, Toshan, is very interesting because I think it points to the complexities here. Because a lot of these, demands for more sustainable production are being driven by consumers in countries like ours who are very concerned about the environment. So it's that needing to think through the consequences all the way down the chain. But if we are going to turn to think about solutions here, perhaps we'll just stick with that one for the moment. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the broad summing up here is that one of the problems is that there are lots of ways in which the richer nations, the more industrially developed nations, essentially kind of they offshore their costs. Basically, they pass them down the line, right? So they demand things, they get things, but they're not picking up the full tab. So isn't one part? Do you think one part of the solution is simply to make the Western companies and consumers pay the real price of their food now? And if so, how do you do that? Because that may sound great as a principle, but can you do it?
I think, see, this is the dilemma. We all want to have sustainable, organic, but if the cost of onions and tomatoes goes up, we know the newspaper headlines are just full of those, and the consumer price inflation and all the inflation indexes, all of us get worried by it. Who cares what's happening in some part which I do not see, but what affects me directly is what concerns me. Now, how do you pay for that? I think there are two angles there. The first angle is really there are inefficiencies across the supply chain, the intermediaries, and so on. And Tara may have the data, but the quantum of food which also goes waste is also a massive number. The wastage itself can feed the rest of the planet, I think, for several times over, because we are not concerned, because the cost of wastage is being borne by somebody else. Okay? We are not, as you rightly said, we are not paying the full cost of the food, especially if you add the environmental tax to it. Okay, we are not paying it. We are the most or the most vulnerable entity is trying to pay it, and it's not as if the African nations or some of the Indonesia, Thailand, they are trying to. Okay, they are trying to do it through the form of minimum support prices, guarantees for the growers, and so on. But that's not sufficient enough. Okay, we are seeing some offshoots in the form of carbon credits and so on, but that is too nascent, and I think we still need to formalize that, because if I do grow food in the right way, if I'm doing right by the planet, I need to get the benefit of it. I mean, as Tara said, global GHG emissions from agriculture between 25 to 30%. But if I'm positive from a carbon standpoint, am I getting anything extra? Okay. Some corporations, some countries are now factoring that into it and saying, okay, this is the additional tab which we are actually going to pass on. Okay. So if that continues to happen and we sort of systematize it and not make it voluntary, okay, if it's voluntary, it's really going to still not be sufficient. So there is enough and more surplus in the system to compensate for it. We just, I think no one country can solve it, because countries' interests are not aligned at all.
Thanks so much. Tara, perhaps you can pick this up, because, I mean, what sort of more systemic aspects need to be changed in order to address these things? And again, there are probably a lot, but maybe just focus on what you think the most important ones are.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an enormous issue, and I just, in a way, I can say something kind of bland in general, or I can bombard you with lots of tiny, tiny, tiny things. I think the big point that I would make is that we need to see problems in the round. We need to look at the interconnections among human health, environmental health, justice. There are sort of the three big sort of bland things, I'll say, is that we need to produce differently, we need to consume differently, and we need to restructure the system. So when it comes to producing differently, the number one thing we need to do is not expand production onto new land. We need to protect land for nature, which means that we need to fit our food needs into the available space, which means that that may mean yield increases in some areas, which have to be done without the use of the chemical inputs that have caused so much damage so far. And it can allow for some reduced inputs, reduced productivity in other areas. But that's the first thing we need to do. Connected to that, we need to consume differently. So, if you look at a third of arable land worldwide is grown to feed, to produce feed to feed animals. That is food that we could be eating directly, or land that we could be releasing to more nutritious foods, or back to nature. And that connects to the question of livestock and meat eating. Now, it's not a simple issue. The idea that you can say meat is good, meat is bad, it's too simplistic. But what we do know is that in the global north, in countries like the UK, but increasingly in many of the rapidly industrializing economies as well, we eat too much meat, and we're increasingly eating more, and that carries a huge environmental cost. Again, it's about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge user of land, and the way in which we rear them, going back to injustice, is wrong and very, very causes huge suffering for animals. So we need to be moderating our consumption of animal products, and we can do that in a way that enables production to increase in the global south. So we need to rebalance it. And then the rebalancing side of things is restructuring the incentives to be producing the food differently, restructuring our kind of market signals, our advertising frameworks, public procurement, so that we are also eating differently, and then addressing the food waste that is in the food supply chain. I don't think personally that is the kind of the panacea, reducing waste, because if I'm a supermarket and I'm selling you less food, then I've got to recoup my profits in some way. Maybe I'll sell you more, body wash or electrical goods or whatever. And like bubbles and wallpaper, the climate impacts will materialize, because the problem in countries like us is consumption. So that goes back to the question of what's a fair price for food. The answer is more than it is today, but rather than dumping everything on food, we have to really look at at our economy, and we have to go wider than that and look at people's jobs and livings, and so that people can afford decent food within the context of all the other things that we need to buy. But ultimately, we need to shift our consumption patterns across the board in the global north. It's food, but it's not just food. So
yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, because you talk about the need to see things in the round, and we're talking about injustices and unfairnesses. And as you said, the consumption has to reduce in the global north. The Eat Lancet report, which for all its imperfections has a lot of sensible things to say, pointed out that as part of the package of decreased overall animal protein sort of consumption, it's partly about a rebalancing, and there are some parts of the world where people can and should actually eat more. It's just that they're going from such a low base. So global north, we've got to massively reduce, but some people got to eat a bit more. So it's not about, everyone's got to go vegetarian. So that's really
also about the land itself. I mean, some parts of the world, livestock or other ruminants have kind of co-evolved with their landscape, and there can be a role for animals there. But the kind of scales of production that we see with intensive animal agriculture, that needs to change. But we cannot suddenly carry on eating the same that we're still eating, but just do it in extensive ways. That's not going to work. We need so much more land. So at the end of the day, you still come back to the need to have animal products as a very moderate part of the overall diet.
Okay, thanks so much. Now, Meshark, I'd like to hear from you about these solutions. You actually, work on the ground with smallholder farmers in East Africa. Are there any things that we can learn from there about where these solutions will lie?
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me start. I think when Toshan was speaking, he mentioned very interesting issues that I just also want to comment on. He mentioned about, the supply chains, the inefficiencies, and the waste associated with those supply chains. And I think that's very important, because then the cost is passed over to the consumer. And in this case, we're talking about the smallholder farmer, who is bearing that cost and translating to unaffordability, and therefore lack of access to all this. I think one of the things that we are looking at is, should we promote long supply chains, or should we look for ways of reducing the supply chains and promoting more localized supply chains? I think that's the question that we need to ask, because the longer the supply chain, the more expensive it is, and the more waste you generate, and the more climate crisis you contribute to. So I think globally, and we just need to look at how our global food chains work. And therefore, for us, we are looking at supporting smallholder farmers develop short, localized markets and localized value chains, because then this is good for the climate, but it's also good for access to the inputs, and access to the food, and access to whatever they need. So I think we need to relook at how we develop and manage supply chains. Of course, we have seen in the last few years how long global supply chains are very vulnerable to global shocks. Look at the COVID-19, how it cut off chains and trade across the continents. Look at the war in Ukraine. I mean, one of the challenges that the African countries have had is access to fertilizer, because much of the fertilizer is coming from Russia and the Asian countries, because of the long supply chains of inputs. So if we can look at short supply chains. And that is why even when we are working with the smallholder farmers, we're encouraging them to develop local markets. And local markets contribute more trust. You know, people know who they are supplying to. They know the prices. They know on the other end how it looks like, and therefore they can produce from an informed perspective. But the long supply chains are very vulnerable, particularly to smallholder farmers and the global shocks, the way we have seen. So I think we just need to rethink on that. Number two, we need to rethink on the production systems, the practice of production system and how they contribute to climate. We train our farmers on sustainable farming, you know, practices. Where, for example, instead of acquiring chemicals that have been produced in Kazakhstan, chemicals that have been produced in I don't know in which country, being shipped all over, contributing to carbon emissions and climate change in Africa, we are training farmers on ecological pest control methods, such as the push-pull, which I think I talked about sometimes, you know, for those who are in the conference. So ecological pest control, ecological management of, you know, regeneration of land, which can produce more and which can be a trigger to localized production and access to food for all, rather than looking at how do we, you know, leave the whole food system to be long chains, you know, global chains, to be led by the market system. Yes, market system is good, but market works better when there is trust and when there is assurance and when there are connections that Toshan was talking about, that when I produce, I know who I am producing for, and I know at what price I'm producing for. So there's some kind of surety and trust that when I produce, I will get income. But we have cases where the smallholder farmers, and I said initially that sometimes we have misled smallholder farmers to produce for export markets they don't know. You can imagine the export markets which they don't know. They either do not know at how much they are going to sell at those export markets, the long supply chains. So in short, what I'm saying is, one, let us really look at the supply chain system. Let us promote localized production. Let us promote localized markets. And let us look at production practices, agriculture production practices that are climate friendly, that regenerate lands rather than degrade lands.
Before I open up to questions, just wanted to follow up on that. So I think that the message is shorter supply chains, reduced inputs, fertilizers, etc., etc. I think that's something everyone will get on board on. And I just want to ask you though, genuine question. Is it important not to be absolutist about this? So on both things. So first, we take the input side. Is it not also the case that actually the problem with fertilizers and pesticides is their massive overuse? And actually, you know, sometimes a little bit of fungicide can save your crop, a little pesticide can save your crop, and it's giving people access to those when they need them appropriately could be a positive thing. Or do you think we can manage it all biologically? And on supply chains, I can see how one might be in favor of a rebalancing towards shorter supply chains, but won't there always be a role for some high value crops to go to export? That's a great way sometimes for people to make money out of certain crops, those high value things, if they do command that high value. So I just wanted to sort of check, you know, to see how absolutist, as it were, you are on those two positions.
Yeah, thanks. Let me start with the latest one about, you know, looking at high value crops where people can make money vis-a-vis localized production. Yes, it is true. It is sometimes long value chains and export can earn income to farmers. But the problem we have had is that the farmers who have attempted to enter into long, you know, chain exports, they have ended up being hungry. They have ended up losing. They have ended up facing hunger and lack of income. You know why? Because sometimes they don't get value for what they produce. And like I said before, that they produce for the market they don't know, because they are always, for smallholder farmers in this case, there are always middle people there who will encourage farmers to grow this for the market that they don't know. And sometimes we have had cases where I think farmers are only, smallholder farmers just used as laborers, because if you look at what they get vis-a-vis whichever, the people who are in the middle who are encouraging farmers and taking the produce from them, they are the ones who are doing very well. They are getting richer. They are having big life. But the farmers who are growing, they are getting poorer and poorer. And that is why most farmers in Africa, including the cash crop growers, for crops that can be exported or that get exported, still remain poor. Why? What's the reason? But the middle people who know how the market works, for example, in Europe, in UK, in China, and they're the ones who are buying from farmers and taking the produce. These people are living good lives. They are, and they are good. That tells you that there's a problem. So unless we make those long global value chains, the export from Africa to other countries, unless we take deliberate steps to make that fair, that farmer is also going to get a fair pay for his labor and for his work and for his land. Until we reach there, it is still not going to work. It is still unfair. Now, you talked about ecological, sustainable agriculture vis-a-vis, use of other inputs and so on. Now, there are two aspects here. Trade-off, what we say the trade-off between use of external inputs that degrade the environment, the soil health and everything, the food poisoning and pollution of environment, vis-a-vis increased production. Now, there needs to be a balance. Yes, in some cases, the external inputs have contributed to increased production. That's true. It's not a lie. It is true. However, with the time, especially when you look at figures and statistics of agriculture production in the African countries, is that since they began using the external inputs in the 1960s, 1970s, production increased. But from the 1980s, production per unit area generally decreased, although the overall gross production increased. But you know why it increased? It increased because farmers moved to virgin lands. So more land was cultivated, more land was reached out for farming, but it's not because that productivity increased per unit area. Actually, productivity per unit area decreased, but the land under production, and that is, I was recently in Zambia, that is happening so much. So farmers will, farm here, and then after they have put the fertilizer, they have sprayed the chemicals and it's no longer productive, they will go in the neighboring virgin land, start cutting down the trees and so on. And that is not the way to go. The thing is, the land that farmers are using can produce and produce and produce more, as long as they look at one thing: regeneration. But she talked about biological conservation and so on. So land can be used as long as we care for it. We put in the farming practices that are more regenerative. It can produce and produce and produce. And that is what we are doing with the smallholder farmers.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, listen, I've got a bit of time for questions. Now, we've got an embarrassment of knowledge and experience here. We've only just scratched the surface of what these people know. I apologize for not being able to get everything, all your insights to the topic here, but some questions give us a few more opportunities. We have a hand here. If we could ask both questions and answers to be as brief as possible at this stage. Perhaps you can say who you are, yeah, if you're good.
We operate, so I speak with a degree of first-hand experience. What I'm hearing tonight, two extremes. You've got a top-down or a bottom-up. So the top-down is Toshan, with mentioning 20,000 acres average farm in Brazil. Then you have Meshark, with an average farm of 2 acres in Kenya. And that is a huge gulf. And how you can bridge those gulfs, I'm not really sure. Because the guy with 2 acres in Kenya, his concern is, will I have enough food to generate enough money to educate my kids? the guy in Brazil is going, we'll have enough profit to buy my new jet. How you can reconcile those things, I'm not sure. What I do believe is that I'm not being paid by Ripple Effect to say this, the way they operate actually brings real results to real people in real situations. And I'm not sure those two guys, Tara and Toshan, can bridge that gulf.
Well, can you bridge that gulf? Or I mean, well, let me take a
No,
minute.
I don't think there is any need to bridge the gulf, because the agricultural systems in the US or in Brazil are designed for a very different objective. Okay, those in Kenya, Nigeria, India, they are designed for a very different objective, which is the small and marginal things. I don't think that if the question would be, if you gave the Nigerian or the Kenyan farmers the choice to say, okay, we will combine all your land holdings, would they want to do that versus not, is one aspect. I think the second one is, it is true that those two gulfs are there, but from the consumer standpoint, okay, how would the consumer think? Because they are getting two very different things. They are getting corn and soya and coffee from a set, and they are getting it at a certain price. Okay, if you try to grow the Kenyan farmer in a small land with the practices and the access, it's it's a very different proposition from a consumer standpoint. Okay, so I don't think we can bridge the gap so long as we can be equally fair to both. By the way, the 20,000 acre is not the largest farmer, it's an average farmer. The rich farmers are like $25 million, $50 million revenues. So they have like tons of things. And by the way, their practices are best in class from a climate change standpoint, the regenerative ag practices, because they have access. They have the profit to keep reinvesting, and they are doing that because they are multi-generational farmers. So to me, it is not as if what they are doing is unfair. I think they are making money because they have access to resources, which the Kenyan farmers do not have. So that's what I would say. I don't think we can bridge the gap. It's from what perspective? From a consumer standpoint, are you looking at it? From the point of view of latest technologies, who's able to apply it? These guys, by the way, by the same logic, Meshark thing, the maximum surplus is actually captured by the financial markets, which are actually trading in those. Okay, they are not even growing or not even actually doing the logistics part of it, but still they have a role to play. I think the question becomes, are they getting compensated for the role they are playing, or is there an unfair thing, and how much unfair is it for both constituents?
Thanks so much. I don't know if you've got more to say, but I want to take another question. So could we go over here and we can wait for the microphone?
I just wonder if the education might be looked at, because children all over Kenya, for example, are being taught towards university rather than smallholder farming.
So I think so, yeah, yes. So we talk about the generations, how the things get passed on. Is there there's a lot of urbanization in lots of countries. In lots of countries, children of smallholder farmers are going away to work in the city. And actually, a lot of the time, I don't know what it's like in Africa, but I know in some parts of the world, the families want that. You know, they don't want their kids to be doing this. So I don't know how is that? How do we have to deal with the younger generation, the people who are going to have a farm in the future? You know, who see perhaps greater prospects away from the land.
Because of the challenges we are talking about, which have made farming to be largely unprofitable. Unfortunately, farming in most African countries is regarded to be a sign of being poor. If you are a farmer, you are poor. And so the young people don't like being poor. They don't want to enter into agriculture because that is, I mean, the lowest cut down of the work that you will do if you are completely desperate and disillusioned. And that is one biggest challenge. It's part of the iniquities that we are talking about. So if we put in systems that can make, you know, smallholder farming become profitable, developing the markets that work, localized markets that can work, so that farming can become an enterprise. that has value, that can generate income, that can employ people, the young people will embrace it because they want money and they are looking for money.
Yeah, I wonder if Toshan will see evidence of this. I mean, I was speaking to people who work with the farmers in Nepal, and it was very interesting again because there was this thing about going away. But one thing they're trying to do is trying to sort of like change the image of farming, and they do exchange programs with Austrian farmers, people, and they're coming in and being entrepreneurial and making money. And even in UK farmers, to be honest, what you're often finding, I've heard lots of stories about British farmers who they see their parents being ground down by the kind of machine of commodities. The younger kids are taking over, they're being enterprising, they're doing new things, and they're actually making the farming life more profitable again. Do either of you see signs of that, of hope there?
I think we see that all the time. I think in the US, the entire Midwest belt, you're seeing the next generation come in, they're taking over from their fathers, saying, let's do a better way of producing. They're also more conscious about the environment, the impact that it has. In Australia, we are seeing that. I think wherever, to Meshark's point, wherever you can make it profitable, viable, you're seeing the next generation does not want to be poor. I mean, who wants to be poor? I mean, it's not a choice you're making. But if you see that you can actually be viable, you can introduce technology, including introduce financial services practices, hedging. I think we are seeing the next generation becoming, it's in certain countries only. Okay, in the UK, we are seeing people take over and make their farm. They actually start making the P&L of the farm first and the balance sheet before even they get into the agronomical practices. But I think with agronomy and the financial viability, I think we are seeing a lot more change happen, but it has to be from the next generation, but also to Tara's point, I think we did a very interesting survey of kids in the parts of the US, saying where does food come from? And the top answer was from the supermarket. They just don't know what all goes into the making of food. So the consciousness about the environment, about the vulnerability, some of the topics we discussed, that's not even there in many parts of the world.
Okay, listen, we are sort of almost out of time. We can hang around and have a drink and informal chat. So if you've got any burning questions, please do ask our panel. But I want each of the panelists just to leave us, just take no more than a minute, leave us with one kind of takeaway, call to action maybe, or call for hope, or just a point you think that the thing you want people to most take away in their heads from this theme this evening. But because we've had the point of top up, bottom down, because Meshark represents the hard end, I'm going to let him go last. So let's go from far end to this end. Toshan.
Okay. I don't know if I'm top down, but still I was just explaining because I have a vantage point of seeing Brazil as well as seeing Kenya. So to me, the point is that we owe it to our future generations. The population of the planet is going to continue to increase. We are continue to have, despite all the intermittent fastings and everything, 3 meals a day. So think about 30 billion meals, okay, per day is not far out in the future, and our land resources are limited. Okay, so I think we owe it to our children and grandchildren to at least put or continue to put the solutions at our individual and institutional level, because otherwise I think we are going to have so much inequality. And we need to remember 150 years back, wars were not fought over oil or it was fought over food. Okay, it's not too much. We've forgotten history, and history will repeat itself unless we learn the lessons.
So a point about making it a priority, and you know, this is something we have to do as citizens. If you look at the last general election and go through the major parties' manifestos and see how much is there on food policy, not a lot, you know. So if we owe it to the generations, we have to make it a political priority as we do other things. Tara, what would be your key takeaway forwards?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that good on hope, right? It's not on a Thursday night, but so I will just perhaps make a plea, which is please, whenever we think about these difficult, challenging issues, we have to remember biodiversity. We have to remember the other species that we share this planet with, and we cannot have discussions about our future without thinking of that, not just because our survival depends upon our positive interactions with other life forms, but because it's the right thing to do. So that's what I would say.
Thanks very much. And Meshark?
Equity, equity, equity. Very important. We all need to have access to food. We all need to live dignified lives, regardless of where you are living. So equity is very important, whatever we do. So with the farmers, we are always with them saying, learn more, grow more, and sell more. It starts from learning, then growing more, then selling more. But above all is equity to ensure that all of us have access to safe, enough, nutritious food.
Thanks so much to everyone there. I mean, one thing that struck me from the discussion is it's a cliche when you talk about this, that, you know, there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing you can do. The food system is incredibly complex. There are lots of different levers that need to be pulled, lots of things that could be done. Yeah, and for some people that may be a cause of despair. Tara says she doesn't do hope very well, and I'm kind of with her on that. I can see that. But I guess the point is, if it is a question of there's no one thing, there are just lots of different levers. I suppose the one thing we can all do is, like, whatever lever you can get a handle on, pull that one, you know, and do what you can. And I think we can be very grateful to the work Ripple Effect does, because it's working within a global food system that it can't change by itself. It can't control a lot of the factors there. The farmers you work with, you know, a lot of the things, they're just at the mercy of certain things. But within that system, you're doing work which gives people the best shot they can. It improves things for them in the way that you can. So yeah, grab your lever, whatever it might be. That doesn't quite make a t-shirt slogan, but maybe we could work on it, and it could be. As I said, you could please, we've got the room for a little bit longer. Have another drink. Please speak more to these fantastically informed and interesting guests. Thank you to the FT. Thank you to Ripple Effect, and thank you all for coming. Thanks so lot. And are we having a final word from our hosts? We are.
All right, is it okay to stand here? Great. So I've just been given a couple of minutes to close, and with how to create a global food system for all and summarize. It's quite a complex question, isn't it? I mean, the word for me that came across a lot was fairness, actually, and really thinking about what we can do from our different perspective. The challenges really are significant. There's all sorts of numbers on how many people are facing hunger. I've heard numbers ranging from 400 million. Sometimes it's 1 in 11 of our world, you know, maybe 800 million. I've even heard numbers up to 1.4 billion. People who permanently face the question of whether they can eat enough tonight or tomorrow. For them, it's a matter of life and death. So what we've heard tonight, you know, there's that expression, once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. What we've heard tonight, I'm sure we'll continue to take with us as we travel home and reflect further. I am maybe, unlike Dr. Tara, I am someone of hope. On Wednesdays. Okay. Well, today I'm someone of hope, and I want to go back to Alison. Actually, is Alison still with us? Alison, hi, Alison. September 2 years ago, the FT advert came up. Maybe Andrew, would you hold this up for us? The FT advert was published, and I'm very excited about this. And I still have this copy with me in my room at home, actually, and I often look at it. And this is Phoebe, and it says, "I'm an investor." And this is for Ripple Effect, we believe our vision is a confident, thriving and sustainable rural Africa. And she's a picture of that. And when I saw that article, I was about to go in fact, Patricia, one of our trustees as well, we were about to go to Uganda the month afterwards. And I said to the team, is there any chance we could visit her farm? Thinking it couldn't be possible. Uganda's quite a large country. And they said, yeah, we can make that happen. So we went to her farm, and the video, which actually I think it's on the Ripple Effect LinkedIn, of her opening this picture and seeing her face on it. I mean, she knew she was going to be on it, but she saw her face and she saw how she was represented, and she just laughed. And on her farm, when we went to her farm, we saw, I don't know whether we've got any pictures. Oh, this is her opening the paper. This is a wonderful farm growing food. It's biodiverse. It's also a diverse range of crops. And it was a picture of what a good smallholding farm can look like. We haven't talked a lot about the social aspects for the farmers that we meet in East Africa. There's a big part of social, of coming together, of learning from other farmers. You know, farmers learn from farmers. We all learn from each other. We spur from each other. We've all learned something today from each other's perspectives. The social aspect is key. And she really is a business person. We saw, you know, certainly at least 2 small businesses that she was running with other people, and she was part of a dairy cooperative as well. And it's got to work. You know, Meshark talked about sustainable farming. It's got to work. Ultimately, food is a human right, and we all deserve to eat. If there's 800 million or more people who don't know whether they're going to be able to eat tonight or to eat tomorrow, that's a serious, serious issue, and we should care about that. We shouldn't go away from this without remembering that. But she, yeah, she is the optimum. And if you look at the next picture, pictures can say 1,000 words. This is the picture on the right was her home before working with Ripple Effect, and the picture on the left is her home afterwards. That's what is possible. That's why I have hope, because of people like her and what she delivers. And we can all do something. This happened because of various different people coming together. We work with local government. We work with research organizations. There's an insect research center headquartered in Nairobi who shared some really good organic pest control methods, the push-pull method. We've got support from, you know, we're able to fund this project and support, the person who leads the project that supported Phoebe is called Uncle Robert T. I can't pronounce his second name, but the funding helps support him in long-term, practical, people-focused patient support for the farmers. And it's bringing all these things together. And then Phoebe is someone who creates ripple effects. When people see her home, when they see her land, when they see her business, when they see that she can feed her family, they copy that and they want to follow that. And Alison, 2 years ago, we had this advert in here, and from this is, again, we're all hearing about this. There's many, many ripples that keep going on through this. So whatever levers we have, we can make a difference together from our different perspectives. I want to really thank you. I'll close now. I want to really thank the panel for sharing from your heart, from your knowledge, from your experience, often from lived experience, from the different businesses and the sectors that you work in. Really appreciate that. It's given us a huge amount to think of. I want to thank all of you for coming here, whether you are supporters, people interested in food systems, whether you're not yet supporters, for the trustees who play an important role as well, and for the FT for hosting us. We really appreciate you being here. Please keep engaging. We have a QR code. Yeah, we have a QR code. If you'd like to scan that, and I think there are also maybe other written things that people can, there's handouts that you can also scan. That will let you know a little bit more about how to stay connected with the work that Ripple Effect do. And I think I forgot to look at any of my notes. Okay. Yeah, I think the key thing is that food is a right for all. Everyone deserves to eat. And let's really press on that. Let's have hope. I believe change is possible. People like Phoebe inspire me. Thank you very much. Thank you.